Welcome after a long break. I hope all of you are feeling healthy. I'm glad to see you all back. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of information to cover. What I was going to talk about today was the early Republic period. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the American Revolution. You can read up on the major events of the American Revolution. I think that's well covered in your textbook. I don't spend a lot of time with it. I do go over and say, these are the battles that happened, blah, 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 blah. And I'll probably go ahead and do that today too. But I wanted to give you a heads up that everything's going to be on video from now on, or it'll be up on YouTube, or it'll be in a Zoom meeting or something. So that's the way we're going to do it the rest of the semester. Hopefully you all can accommodate what we're going to be doing. So anyway, I did want to say a few things about women in the American Revolution. There were some significant participants in the American Revolution. I think for one of the classes I was able to talk a little bit about Molly Pitcher, but there were some others. Phyllis Wheatley, who is considered the poet of the American Revolution. In fact, George Washington met her and was very enamored by her work, as she had produced a book on poetry. Anyway, there is a wood engraving of her, but I don't generally keep that with me and share that in class. I do share it on the PowerPoint, but I'm not going to be able to show it to you today. What I did want to talk about is the Paris Peace Treaty of 1783, which formally ended the war. Initially, there was some quibbling over who was going to pay for what, war reparations, that kind of thing. Anyway, we'll get to that. The United States did agree to pay for some losses in North America, some property that had been taken, but that's about it. About 10, 15 years ago, some Canadian national tried to sue the Massachusetts state government through the Massachusetts Supreme Court, the federal government, for land that had been taken from one of his ancestors who had been a Tory during the American Revolution. But it had amounted to about, a square mile of land in downtown Boston. Of course, that was never going to happen, and so they threw the case out. But anyway, I did want to talk a little bit about the government that was created. During the American Revolution, they operated under what is called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was simply a patchwork, loose confederation of separate state entities working together to try to accomplish the goal of defeating England. But they had no power to enforce taxation, and when they asked for taxes to be contributed, only limited amounts of money were sent in by the various state governments. So they had no power, no mechanism to enforce the collection of that money. They had no power to raise troops for a common defense, which is part of the Federalist system and what is good for our federal system. There was no standardized commerce laws, which meant there could be multiple types of currency going around. But more importantly, when it came to taxation, if you were going from one state, let's say from Georgia up to New York, technically you could be charged at every state border for state sales taxes or property taxes coming through. And finally, there was two other things. There was no executive branch, and there was no judiciary branch, a supreme judicial organization or a chief executive officer, like a kind of a king, but more of a president kind of thing, or prime minister to try to run things. So there were some issues, even though George Washington did try to keep a steady hand on things. He was there for most of the issues and problems. So the main problem comes into focus when economic chaos is running rampant in the new North America, the new United States, but of course it really wasn't called the United States yet. But probably the most important was Shays Rebellion in 1786. Shays Rebellion was basically Captain Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary officer, who had a problem with his taxes being collected, his property taxes collected in the state of Massachusetts. So herein lies the problem with Massachusetts. Massachusetts had a vigorous tax foreclosure system on farms, and large numbers of Revolutionary War veterans had lost their farms due to back taxes. And so Daniel Shays led a group of followers to stop the court in Springfield, Massachusetts, from hearing any more bankruptcy cases, repossession cases, basically. And so he and his armed followers were basically dealt with through the state government. The Massachusetts governor sent a memo to the president asking him what to do, and Washington says, either meet their grievances or suppress them, and they were suppressed. He was charged, and he was actually sentenced to death. But it was commuted, and later he was freed and absolved of the charges. But I want to I use this as an example of how bad the economic problems were, given at by even mid 1780s. By 1787, there was a call for a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. The first meeting did not transpire in Annapolis, Maryland, but the second did. And so they met in Philadelphia. Patrick Henry, who was a wily kind of founding father, said he didn't like what was going on at the Constitutional Convention because he smelled a rat. But one of the problems at the state at the Federal Convention the Federal Constitutional Convention, was basically that the majority of the people there were wealthy. They had something to lose. But in general, they were fairly honorable men who understood the burden of governing as a sacred duty and not something to be exploited for your personal wealth. And that is something that they really frowned upon, and they hate state politicians because of it. They saw themselves as looking out for the better good of this new country. So most of the representatives that come to the Constitutional Convention are pretty much in agreement that they need a government, and they want a strong central government. And they want a strong central government primarily because they want to protect their vested interests. Think about who is there. These are the founding fathers, many of them, but there are others, wealthy men, shipping magnates, plantation owners. So they had money, they had something to lose, but they had something to add too. They were well educated. They were doing something for the common good, for the greater good of all, and they really, really frowned upon people like state politicians, and I have to tell you that Aaron Burr was one of the people that they really frowned upon because he acted like a state politician. And it's not that he killed Alexander Hamilton. That's not it. He made a lot of money while he was in office, and that in itself was what was frowned upon. So anyway, most of the founding fathers wanted a strong, stable government. But they wanted their personal rights to be respected, and they wanted their cultural rights from where they lived in their state to be respected too, with any type of new government that was created. So the first big branch of government that was created was, of course, the legislative branch, and this was the real booger of the bunch to debate about. They spent an enormous amount of time talking about this. In fact, they spent about 6 weeks talking about it. George Washington, and on the last day of the convention, got so tired of talking about it that he finally stood up and he said some of the few words that he spoke at the Constitutional Convention. And he said, I think it's just it's a matter of semantics. They want to move from 41 representative for every 40,000 to one for every 30,000, not more than one for every 30,000. Instead of one, not more than one for every 40,000. I think this is a reasonable response that we can say yes. and just to get the ball moving forward. Of course, the other big booger was, what are we going to do with the slave count in the South? The South is going to want to count them as citizens, even though they don't give them any rights. And the South is thinking, yeah, we get to count them as slaves for representation in this house that we're going to create, this legislative body that they'll be counted. So that's the other big booger of how they're going to be counted for apportionment within the House of Representatives. So let's just talk about the legislative branch real quick. You've basically got a couple plans out there. You've got the Virginia plan, which is the large state plan, which called for a Senate and a House based on a state's population, which would, of course, given a huge advantage to the bigger states. Think about it like this today. You've got states like Wyoming and Alaska, which have really less than 1 million people. And so they get 2 senators and 1 representative. Really, in the Senate, they're kind of overrepresented based on their population, because you've got other states like California, New York, Florida, Texas that have these massive populations that also only have 2 senators. Now, they have many more representatives, but of course, the senior legislative body is the Senate. So the other plan that came out was what is called the New Jersey plan. It called for equal representation in a unicameral legislature based, regardless of size or state, size or population of a state. And this was put forward, of course, by New Jersey because they were a small state like Rhode Island, and they would have been dominated in this new government if some of the bigger states would have had their way. What they came up with was what is called the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, which called for a 2-house legislative body, an upper house with equal representation from all states, what is our Senate, equal to other legislative bodies around the world, like the House of Commons, what is their House of Lords. And then it called for a lower house, what is our House of Representatives, based on population, where in England it would be considered the House of Commons. Everything, and that is important to understand, that the first apportionment that was taking place was based on the population, the census. That's what that does every 10 years. The first one was done in 1790. And basically what that does is it provides for a mechanism to give appropriate legislative representation in the lower house, the House of Representatives, again, every 10 years through apportionment. Now, what's happened over the last 20, 30 years is that northeastern states, old Rust Belt states, have lost seats to the South. Tennessee gained 1, North Carolina gained 1. Almost all of your Sun Belt states gained seats because of the census that comes out. So all of this, of course, is written into the Constitution in the very first few sections of it. So the other big booger that we talked about was the the other big booger about the legislative body was, how are you going to count the slaves? Now, what they came up with, what is called the ThreeFifths Compromise. The North was saying, well, listen, man, if you can say that these people are being counted as citizens, but you're not treating them as such, then we can count our mules because you're calling them 4-legged animals, and we are too. And the North also wanted a cutoff date, and so the cutoff date is established as 1807, January 1. That is the first cutoff date for the future importation of slaves into North America, which of course is one of the reasons why you have a smaller percentage in the Western Hemisphere of African imports, slave imports into North America, because of the ban put in place, and the ban later, of course, put in place by England, which I will try to get to. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about with that Three-Fifths Compromise is that, so every slave is not counted as a citizen. They're going to be counted as 3/5 of a citizen. It doesn't matter for the South because they're willing to make this accommodation only because they know that with this overwhelming population of slaves, they're going to be able to dominate in the House of Representatives. And if you look at the House of Representatives, the representation up to the Civil War. The South, in fact, did dominate the House of Representatives based on its large slave population. So two factions begin to emerge at the Constitutional Convention. What are the Federalists, who tended to be wealthy, upper crust, Northern, John Jay, George Washington, although he's a Southerner, Alexander Hamilton. They all want a strong central government. Then you have the Anti-Federalists, who are basically saying, no, we need to have some states' rights and more balanced type of government. They're generally from the South. They're more poor. They are generally farmers, of the planter class. They oppose the original Constitution when it's developed. The Anti-Federalists oppose it because they don't believe that they have enough say in the new government. They're disturbed with that there's no Bill of Rights. In fact, they refuse to leave, basically, until there is a Bill of Rights, what is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And so they worried that if you had a strong central government, ultimately Washington, D.C., where the capital would be built, would become an armed city, and a Federalist army would be sent out to wreak havoc on the state militias and the state governments. And that's the way some of the Anti-Federalists try to paint a Federalist-type system. Of course, they wanted a weak central government with strong states' rights. And, of course, that states' rights argument, the 10th Amendment to this Constitution, all powers not delegated to the federal government are given to the states therein, is basically the vehicle by which states' writers still make that point. It's not written in the Constitution, so it's not it's not written in the Constitution, so therefore it's not a federal issue. It is a state issue, and it's under our jurisdiction. And so anyway, you have the executive branch is created. The executive branch doesn't call for a vice president. It does, but it doesn't call for it to be of the same party. The president has to be elected by what is a plurality of votes from the Electoral College, which is a equal representation of the legislative body. You vote for electors every off cycle year, and they are supposed to vote the way the representative in the House of Representatives actually votes for president. And so the magic number, of course, today for the election of presidents is 270. Whatever presidential election you're watching, I've been watching them since I was a little kid. I was always enamored with them. But today, it's 270 is the magic number. When you hit 270, 271, you just go on to bed. The game's over. You know who won. So the other thing that I wanted to mention to you is the development of the federal judiciary and what is the Judiciary Act of 1789, which creates the federal and district court system. It organizes the Supreme Court. John Jay, of course, was the first Chief Justice. There were 5 associate justices. Later, they figured it out that, wow, it's kind of an odd number, 6, or an even number. You need not 6, you need 7 at least. Today, we have 9 Supreme Court justices. They came up with a better plan later. They made some minor changes to it. But it also created the Office of Attorney General to be an advocate for the office of the president and to work for the federal government. So the biggest problem, once the government is up and running, is how to get the government out of debt. And Alexander Hamilton came up with a brilliant plan called the Funding Proposal of 1790. By which all federal debt, state debt, and debt owed to foreigners and everything would be rolled, state debt, federal debt, and debt owed to foreigners would all be rolled into one lump sum, and a new monetary unit would be issued. So they began to take in the continental bonds. The problem was people like Aaron Burr found out that this is what the government's going to do. So he sent agents out into the western districts of all the states where they didn't know what was happening and had them buying up these old continental bonds, 10 and 25 cents on the dollar. And then he was bringing them back and getting them in exchange for the full faith and credit of the U.S. government in a new currency issue. So if he brings in a $50 Continental bond that he paid $10 for, he's going to get a new $50 bill that's actually worth $50 instead of this promissory note that had been given as an emergency during the war. So they had to monetize the United States and provide us with some type of currency unit, and the funding proposal was the means by which they did it. So I want you to think of it like this. Taxes go to pay off these debts. As the federal government takes in taxes, federal taxes, those excise, income taxes, etc., go to pay for these things. The easiest way to explain the funding proposal of 1790 is to explain how a local school board funds the building of a new high school, which of course Madison County desperately needs one. They've always needed one. They probably really need two now. And that is basically the local community offers a bond. They issue a $50 or $20 million bond to build a new high school. That $20 million bond is a very safe bet. And so property taxes are saved by the local government to pay for these debts. And these bonds, basically, they're double coupon bonds. If you invest in them, when you cash them in, you don't pay taxes on them, basically. And so they're fairly lucrative. Corporations buy them up because they're returning better than the federal government is today in T-notes or T-bills and bonds. And so you've got all this money that you're going to have to expend to build this high school. You're going to use the tax base coming in to pay for it over time. You issue bonds, 10, 20, 30-year bonds. So you're saving up money for the 10-year bonds, saving up money for the 20-year bonds, saving up money from the 30-year bonds from the property taxes to ultimately pay the dividends out for those bonds that are issued. That's basically how they operated. The next big thing that I want to talk to you about, which really impacts the United States and solidifies a lot of political views amongst the Founding Fathers, is the Wars of the French Revolution. The Wars of the French Revolution began in 1792 when the president when the revolutionaries on the streets of France basically overthrew the monarchical system of King Louis, put him under house arrest, etc., and then executed him in 1793. The French Revolution is based on the American Revolution, and half of the revolutions in Latin America, Central America, and even South America that occur after our revolution are based on the same principles as our revolution was. So this is important to understand, that other countries followed our lead with this ideal of democracy. And in fact, if you look at revolutionary France, they wore blue, which represents republicanism. And they were trying to create which they did, through what is the French Republic. They threw off the yoke of oppression. They got rid of a state church. They got rid of the vestiges of feudalism. They did a lot of different things. But most notably, they executed King Louis. There was a lot of push by the Federalists to stay out of it. There was a push by the Anti-Federalists to get involved. The Anti-Federalist attacks on George Washington, who was our first president, became so vitriolic that in his second term he almost cried at night, just reading and thinking about what he had read all day. What the newspapers had said about him. So he was somewhat embittered too. He wasn't really happy with the Anti-Federalists for these attacks, but it wasn't really Thomas Jefferson doing it. It was his followers who were constantly chewing away, nipping at the edges of Washington for trying to keep us out of it, and really kind of siding with England, because we did have some economic partnerships with England at the time. But the Anti-Federalists were concerned that we were going back to our old habits, dealing with England again, and that maybe we really, really should take a look at siding with France, who is a natural ally. They're undergoing a democratic revolution like we did, etc., etc. So the Jeffersonians actually liked this idea of taking the British West Indies from England and basically setting it up as part of the United States. A guy by the name of Citizen Genet, who was the French ambassador to the United States, arrived in Charleston. And he tried to drum up support for this idea of taking the British West Indies for the United States, only because they wanted to get them out of the Gulf of Mexico to where they could expand Haiti and some of the other colonial holdings that they had. And Citizen Genet made the point. He said, the United States, we helped them out 1778 after the Battle of Saratoga. Through the Franco-American Alliance, we helped them with all this material goods, gunpowder, and some of our people helped come over and lead their troops, blah, 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 blah. And basically, that was okay to say all those things until he started directly attacking George Washington. When he began to attack George Washington publicly, he was immediately classified persona non grata, and deportation proceedings against him were immediately drawn up. And so he did like any self-respecting, immigrants would want to do where they were staying, and that is simply he married an American woman. Going home, of course, meant that he may have faced the guillotine. His political faction had just lost power. And the guillotine becomes the means by which in France that they get rid of politicians who don't work out, the Aaron Burrs of this world. And in fact, during the French Revolution, something like 60 to 80,000 politicians lost their lives with the guillotine and through other means, through radical political coup d'etats, etc. The United States, in response to France and its revolutionary fervor in France starting a war with England, issued the Proclamation Act of 1793 and basically said, you know what, they cut off the king's head, we're going to stay out of this one, even though, the Franco-American Alliance was there, we're just not going to deal with it. Well, they made a mistake because England took advantage of the opportunities from then on until the War of 1812. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which occurred out on the western frontier, General Anthony Wayne was sent in to suppress the Algonquin who had risen up against the United States with British support. George Rogers Clark, his Kentucky Long Knives, and some others brutally suppressed this, and the Treaty of Greenville was forced upon the Algonquin in the Pays-d'Enhaut, the Treaty of Greenville, 1793, whereby the Indians were required to abandon their British allies, even though Fort Detroit is still sitting on American soil, and it is still invested by British regular army troops. The Indians had to give up all their claims to Ohio and Indiana, setting up what becomes the old Northwest, was that, and that would have included Illinois. Ohio and Indiana are brought into the Union very quickly through the Northwest Ordinance. Make sure you understand how the Northwest Ordinance operates, how states are brought in through a territorial system. It also, by the treaty, it also imposed federal authority over the natives and the whites living in there who were dealing with the natives in a fairly unscrupulous manner. The Pinckney Treaty of 1795 granted free navigation on the Mississippi River to the United States from Spain and through the port of New Orleans. It also gave West Florida up to the 31st parallel to the United States, what is the bulk of Alabama and Mississippi. Washington, those are just some of the small territorial gains, important territorial gains, up to the Mississippi River under Washington. Washington in 1796 gave his farewell address. He recommended we avoid all foreign permanent entangling alliances, like NATO, like anything, because he favored only temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. However, he did say we should also avoid bitter partisanship, which of course today is run rampant in Washington. Then the ball goes into the court of the French, in what is known as the Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who becomes the French foreign minister under revolutionary France, and what is called the XYZ affair. The French Directory, which was in power by then, had begun confiscating U.S. ships on the high seas as prizes of contraband of war, because they were trading with England. And the United States sent a delegation to meet with the Directory. But before they could meet with the Directory, they had to meet with Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who was the French foreign minister, and he demanded a $250,000 bribe in gold. Rather than immediately pay this, they sent a message back to the United States, what should we do? They sent a message back saying, millions for defense, but not one penny for tribute, is what John Adams said as he had just rolled into office. So between 1798, really 1797, and 1800, there was an undeclared war of navies between France and the United States. This led to the Convention of 1800, by which the United States government forever ended the Franco-American alliance. The U.S. agreed to pay for any damages and claims to American shipping concerns. So we effectively ended the Franco-American alliance officially and forever with that. That was the last major alliance that we were in until NATO. We've been in NATO since 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So in Adams' in Adams' first term of office, John Adams was the heir apparent to Washington. He becomes president in 1797. But when he comes into office, the vitriolic attacks by the Anti-Federalists had not stopped. And so finally, in 1798, Adams pushes through Congress with Federalist support the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is really an overreaction to the Jeffersonians and their loyalty towards the French. What the Alien and Sedition Acts do is it increases the time to become a citizen from 5 years to 14 years. And they did this because they wanted to target the French who were trying to maybe get citizenship in the former Pays-d'Enhaut. It also provided fines and imprisonment for impeding government policies and defaming government officials and even the president. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison said very little. They went back to their respective state legislatures and they drafted what are now called the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which basically said the Constitution is simply a compact or contract between the states. And that's all. And the states, if they find something repugnant to their state constitution, or if a state finds that the central government has overstepped the Constitution, then they can nullify any federal law that they think oversteps the federal Constitution. Of course, all of this is a smokescreen for the institution of slavery. The next big thing that happens, of course, is the election of 1800. John Adams, who really couldn't get anything done in his government, and resentment had grown exponentially against him through the Anti-Federalists, simply really didn't really want to run. He didn't have a chance in the second election. Jefferson attacked him for having a pool table and all kinds of things. In the election of 1800, Aaron Burr almost won the election. He was thrown into the House of Representatives, and it's there that Alexander Hamilton said publicly that Aaron Burr was a wicked man. How could you give him your votes? And so he swayed enough votes over from the House of Representatives to Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson was elected. Now, The election of 1800 is a watershed moment in American history. It's a watershed moment in American history because you've got an official change of political parties from the Federalists to the Anti-Federalists with really no violence. I mean, there was some political violence, but there's no death. There's not a war. There's not a civil war being fought. There's no coup d'etat. And it set the standard for what would happen in the United States. Now, I need to talk to you a little bit about Thomas Jefferson. I don't want to spend a lot of time with him, but I do want to mention a few things and get you up to the Louisiana Purchase. So, let me say this about Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr did not immediately, he became persona non grata. He ran for governor of New York and lost after that. He was a very embittered man. He felt that what Alexander Hamilton had said about him in the House of Representatives just literally destroyed his career. And so anything bad that ever happened to him after that, he kept blaming on that moment. He later went on to organize Tammany Hall in New York City, which was a very powerful political organization well through the 19th century, even into the beginnings of the 20th century. Remember that he is the grandson of the Great Awakening preacher Jonathan Edwards. Aaron Burr, because he got the second largest number of votes in the election of 1800, actually was vice president. But when he began to immediately intrigue against the president, Thomas Jefferson, he was forced to resign and he went home, again, a very disgruntled man, because Hamilton called him a wicked man. And anyway, he kills Alexander Hamilton on July 11th, 1804, in a duel. There's another story about the dueling pistols. I wish I had time to talk to you about dueling pistols, but we don't have time to talk about it. One of the important cases that comes up during Jefferson's first term of office is a Supreme Court case. It's a landmark precedent-setting Supreme Court case which allows the Supreme Court to just suck up enormous amounts of power. And the ruling is issued in 1803. It's called Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury is suing James Madison, the Secretary of State, for his position within the federal judiciary. The Federalists, as they are leaving power in 1800, do a bunch of midnight appointments to the bench, trying to pack the bench with Federalist judges. He sues when the Anti-Federalists don't give him his seat on the bench. And so Marbury sues to get Madison to get his seat, and it ends up in the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice John Marshall, who is a Federalist, and who's Jefferson's cousin, by the way, they hated each other, came up with this ingenious plan. Basically, they said, okay, so they take two slaps. They kind of slap the Federalists and they slap the Anti-Federalists at the same time. But what they do is they said, first, the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch does not interpret the Constitution, nor does the president. The Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. And so if anything comes up that is subject to judicial review reflective of the needs of the Constitution, then that it is the purview of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court only to deal with that issue. What that does, though, is it's a slap at the Anti-Federalists who think that their state Supreme Courts are supreme over the federal government. No, this sets up the Supreme Court as the super law of the land. It is the highest court of the land. It is very difficult to get a case to the Supreme Court. It is very difficult to practice in front of the Supreme Court. You got to have a special certificate. You can't just be some practicing, jackleg attorney from Jackson that's going to go out there and go, yeah, I'm going to practice before the Supreme Court. No, you have to be trained. You have to go to certain schools. You have to have certain certifications, etc. Anyway, so what the case of Marbury versus Madison does is it establishes the third branch of our government. Up to that point, the judicial branch really hadn't done much. They had the courts functioning. But they got tired of it, saying, these states are doing whatever the hell they want. We're going to have some continuity across the board. So I think this is a very important case, especially for economics, to understand why we have a federal system and not a states' rights system operating in the United States today. I do want to mention a woman to you in the early Republic period, Mercy Otis Warren. She was married to James Warren, who was a Massachusetts state legislator. He had a sister, by the way, named Mercy Otis Warren was married to James Warren, a Massachusetts state legislator. She is the sister of James Otis, who is a signatory to the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence. I want to say his signature is the second largest up there. I know John Hancock's is the first. You can't miss that one. And by the way, some people say he tried to erase his name later after he signed. What's important about Mercy Otis Warren is she was the first female American playwright and historian in American history. Her book that she wrote was called The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. It was written in 1805. So you remember the Federalists who had talked about Republican motherhood and don't worry about having the right to vote, we'll take care of you. Well, women saw in the Anti-Federalists what they were seeing in France, women being given the right to vote, equality before the law, these kinds of things. And so women saw this as an opportunity for Jefferson, and they thought that Jefferson was going to enfranchise women and give women more basic rights. And so when he did not, after his first term of office, she wrote this book in 1805. So the last thing that I want to talk about before we get into, and I'm going to talk about the Western expansion and Louisiana Territory in the next unit. But the last thing that I want to talk to you about today is Haiti. During the French Revolution, in the early stages, they emancipated all the slaves within the French colonial empire. Because if you believe in the principles of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the principles of democracy, then how can you hold people in slavery? And so the French idealistically freed all the slaves within the Caribbean and everywhere else. Napoleon, after 1800, in his wars against England, what we call the Napoleonic Wars or the Wars of the French Revolution, began to need money. And so he tried to reestablish slavery in Haiti. He sent his son-in-law, Leclerc, with about 15,000 troops to Haiti to reinstitutionalize the peculiar institution, as slavery was called in the South. And with no luck, 12,000 out of 15,000 either died of malaria, yellow fever, dengue, or were killed in ambushes and various attacks, assassinations, what have you. And so he began to look for a way out. What am I going to do with this Western Hemisphere empire that I have? I've got holdings in Asia and Africa that are much more valuable and more important. How am I going to get rid of this stuff? I need to sell. And so he offered to the United States a sale of what is Louisiana, and Haiti became the first. Let me go backtrack. Haiti became the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Today, today, nobody supported it, which makes it one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. But France was gradually but slowly shedding her colonial empire. The remnants of her foreign empire in Asia were not gotten rid of until the 1850s. And even Africa, I think even after that. So Haiti underwent a democratic revolution. They had elected a president, wrote a constitution very similar to ours. But France wanted money. Quietly in 1802 or 1803, Spain, which had controlled the land west of the Mississippi River, and because Napoleon had put his son-in-law on the throne of Spain, he basically uh, had Spain cede that land back to France, and then offered it for sale to America, and we bought it for $15 million. It was a steal. A little less than 1 million square miles of land. You can't buy land for that. Anyway, it was negotiated by James Madison and Robert Livingston. It was submitted to the Senate for ratification after it was already signed by Jefferson, only because Jefferson said, time is of the essence. I can't pass this deal up. I understand that. You should too. It's like the guy that says, or the gal that says, hey, I could buy this $10,000 car today for $2,000. I can get the money at home, but I got to go talk to my significant other. And once we work that out, I'm coming back tomorrow and I'm going to buy it. And it's gone. So you understand that. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about in the next unit that we're going to talk about is going to be the explorers who go west. And I'll talk about the War of 1812. Hope you all have a wonderful day. I hope you all stood by me long enough to hear this long lecture. Have a great day. Stay safe. Stay healthy.